The canvas tent shudders as another shell explodes in the distance, and Sister Margaret Hayes doesn't even flinch anymore. At 26, she's seen enough broken bodies and dying boys to last 10 lifetimes, yet here she stands in a Normandy field hospital 3 weeks after D-Day, preparing for another day that will test every ounce of strength she has left. The wounded keep coming in endless waves, some crying for their mothers, others silent with shock, all of them looking to her steady hands and calm voice for salvation. Between the blood-soaked bandages and hastily scribbled last letters home, Margaret holds on to the small moments that remind her why she chose this calling. But when a critically wounded German prisoner arrives alongside Allied soldiers, will her oath to heal all patients be tested beyond its breaking point? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's fingers moved automatically along the worn rosary beads, each smooth pearl, a familiar comfort in the pre-dawn darkness. The beads had belonged to her mother, passed down through 3 generations of Hayes women, and now they carried the weight of prayers, whispered in a canvas tent thousands of miles from home. "Hail Mary, full of grace," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery. The Blessed Mother had watched over her through 18 months of training at St. Bartholomew's, through the devastating night when news came of David's death at Dunkirk, and through 6 months of tending wounds in this God-forsaken corner of France. The tent around her breathed with the rhythm of sleeping patients. 42 beds arranged in precise rows, most occupied by soldiers whose dreams carried them far from this place of pain. Some moaned softly in their sleep, reliving battles or calling for loved ones. Others lay silent, their breathing shallow but steady, grateful for any respite from consciousness. Margaret had volunteered for field service the day after David's funeral. The parish priest had warned her against making decisions during grief, but she knew with crystalline clarity that sitting in a London hospital, tending minor ailments while the world burned, would slowly kill her soul. If David could give his life for freedom, she could give her comfort for healing. The field hospital occupied what had once been a farmer's pasture, now transformed into a maze of canvas structures connected by wooden walkways. The main surgical tent stood at the center, surrounded by recovery wards, supply depots, and sleeping quarters for the medical staff. Barbed wire marked the perimeter, and sentries walked their posts through the night, but everyone knew that canvas offered little protection if the Germans decided to target medical facilities. Sister Catherine stirred in the cot beside her, the older woman's grey hair escaping from beneath her cap. At 53, Catherine had served in the Great War, and her steady presence anchored the younger nurses when horror threatened to overwhelm their training. She opened her eyes and smiled at Margaret's quiet devotions. "Morning prayers again, dear?" "Force of habit, sister. Mother always said the day belonged to God before it belonged to us." Catherine nodded, understanding. Half the nurses maintained some form of morning ritual, prayer, meditation, or simply a few moments of silence before the chaos began. It helped preserve whatever remained of their civilian selves beneath the military efficiency that battlefield medicine demanded. Margaret finished her rosary and tucked the beads into her uniform pocket, where they would remain throughout the day, a tangible reminder of faith when doubt crept in. Outside, the first grey light of dawn filtered through the tent walls, and she could hear the orderlies beginning their morning rounds. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning quiet. Margaret's trained ear distinguished between the steady rumble of supply trucks and the urgent roar of ambulances carrying fresh casualties. This morning brought ambulances, their engines straining as they navigated the muddy roads from the front lines. "Here we go," Catherine murmured, already reaching for her cap and apron. Margaret rose from her knees, smoothing her uniform and checking that her supplies were properly arranged. The ritual preparation had become as automatic as breathing, bandages within easy reach, surgical instruments cleaned and ready, morphine carefully rationed according to the previous day's inventory. Through the tent opening, she could see the first ambulance pulling to a stop beside the triage area. Two orderlies jumped down and began unloading stretchers with practiced efficiency. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the dark stains that marked urgent cases. A young soldier stumbled past her tent, supporting another man whose arm hung at an unnatural angle. Both wore the mud-caked uniforms of infantry, their faces bearing the hollow expression of men who had seen too much in too little time. "Sister," one of the orderlies called, "we need triage in the main tent." Margaret exchanged a final glance with Catherine, both women understanding that the day's first test had arrived. Whatever peace they had found in morning prayers would have to sustain them through the hours ahead. She touched the rosary beads in her pocket one last time, drawing strength from their familiar weight, then stepped into the growing chaos of another day at war. Margaret's surgical scissors caught the morning light as she cut away the blood-soaked fabric from a young private's leg. The metal had bent slightly during yesterday's emergency surgery, when she'd used them to cut through a thick leather boot, but they still functioned well enough for field work. Nothing stayed pristine in a battlefield hospital. "Easy now, lad," she murmured as the soldier winced. "I need to see what we're working with here." The boy couldn't be more than 19, his cheeks still soft with youth, despite the mud and stubble. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his thigh, missing the major artery by inches. Lucky, though he wouldn't feel lucky for weeks to come. Around them, the main treatment tent buzzed with controlled urgency. 3 ambulances had arrived in the past hour, disgorging their cargo of wounded men with mechanical efficiency. Sister Catherine worked 2 beds over, cleaning a shoulder wound while humming softly under her breath. The new nurse, Sister Anne, struggled with a complicated dressing change, her hands still uncertain despite months of training. "Sister Hayes," Dr. Morrison called from across the tent, "need you for triage on the new arrivals." Margaret nodded, finishing the boy's bandage with quick, practiced movements. "Keep that leg elevated, Private. Someone will be round with breakfast soon." The triage area occupied the front section of the main tent, where incoming casualties were sorted according to the brutal mathematics of battlefield medicine. Those who could wait were marked with green tags. Yellow tags meant urgent but stable. Red tags required immediate surgery. Black tags meant there was nothing more they could do. The latest batch included 2 men she recognized from previous visits. Sergeant Williams had taken shrapnel in his back 3 weeks ago and apparently hadn't stayed in the rear echelons long enough for proper healing. He grinned sheepishly as she examined his reopened wounds. "Couldn't stay away from your charming bedside manner, sister. More likely you couldn't stay away from the front lines when you should have been resting." She tagged him yellow and moved on. "Report to Sister Catherine for cleaning and fresh dressings." The next stretcher held a Scottish corporal whose uniform bore the insignia of the Highland Regiment. His left arm hung at an impossible angle, bone visible through torn flesh, but his eyes remained clear and focused. He spoke in the lilting accent of the Highlands, his voice steady despite obvious pain. "How bad is it, lass?" Margaret examined the arm carefully, her trained fingers assessing damage without causing additional trauma. The break was clean enough for setting, assuming they had the supplies and time for proper surgery. "You'll keep the arm, but it'll be a while before you're playing the bagpipes again." She marked him red. "Straight to surgery for you." As the orderlies carried him away, she noticed him trying to reach something in his breast pocket with his good hand. Margaret retrieved a small photograph, a young woman in a wedding dress, smiling beside a man in Highland dress uniform. "Your wife, Moira, married her just before shipping out. Haven't told her about this yet." His voice carried the weight of men everywhere who faced the prospect of returning home changed. "You'll tell her yourself when you get home," Margaret said firmly, tucking the photograph back into his pocket. "And she'll be grateful to have you back, arm or no arm." The next several casualties blurred together in a routine that had become second nature. Bullet wounds, shrapnel injuries, blast trauma, and the occasional case of trench foot or dysentery. Each man received the same careful assessment, the same gentle touch, the same honest evaluation of his chances. A young lieutenant arrived, conscious but pale, his uniform indicating he belonged to one of the elite commando units. Unlike the others, he seemed more concerned about a canvas bag he clutched against his chest than his own obvious injuries. "Sister, I need to get these dispatches to command. They're more important than... Son, Margaret interrupted gently, the only thing more important than your health right now is staying alive to deliver those dispatches yourself. She examined the deep laceration across his ribs. This needs cleaning and stitching, but you'll live to fight another day. As she worked, the bent scissors caught the light again, their damaged edge serving as a reminder that everything in this place bore scars of the work it was called to do. People, tools, even the canvas tent walls showed the effects of constant stress and emergency use. The lieutenant relaxed as she cleaned his wound, finally allowing the orderlies to take his precious bag for safekeeping. Trust came hard to soldiers fresh from combat, but gradually they learned that the field hospital represented safety, competence, and the promise of eventual return to normal life. Margaret finished with the immediate triage cases and paused to survey the tent. 23 new patients in the past hour, distributed according to need and available resources. The work continued. The water-damaged photograph trembled in Margaret's hands as she pulled it from her apron pocket. David's face smiled back at her through the moisture stains, his RAF uniform crisp and proud in the studio portrait taken just weeks before Dunkirk. The image had been soaked during yesterday's sudden rainstorm when she'd rushed to help move supplies, and now his features blurred slightly at the edges, as if he were fading away all over again. "Mail call," Corporal Jenkins announced, entering the recovery tent with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The patients who could sit up did so immediately, hope lighting faces that had grown accustomed to disappointment. Margaret tucked David's photograph away and moved to help distribute the letters. This ritual occurred twice weekly when conditions allowed, bringing fragments of home to men who sometimes wondered if the world beyond this battlefield still existed. "Private Henderson?" She held up an envelope addressed in careful feminine handwriting. A sandy-haired boy from Yorkshire raised his hand eagerly. His leg was healing well from the shrapnel wound he'd received 2 weeks ago, and he'd be returning to his unit soon. The letter bore a London postmark and the faint scent of lavender. "That'll be from my mum," he said, accepting the envelope with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "She writes every Sunday after church." Margaret moved through the tent, matching names to addresses, watching faces transform as connections to distant loved ones materialized in paper and ink. Some men received multiple letters, others waited hopefully only to be disappointed again. She had learned to keep her expression neutral during these moments, neither celebrating others' joy nor dwelling on individual sorrow. "Sister Hayes," called a voice from the corner bed, "could you read mine? Eyes aren't quite right yet from the blast." Sergeant Morrison had suffered a concussion along with his other injuries, and reading still caused severe headaches. Margaret settled into the chair beside his bed and carefully opened the envelope postmarked from Wales. "My dearest Tommy," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the tent. Other patients listened openly, understanding that letters became communal property when privacy proved impossible. "I hope this finds you well and safe. The harvest is coming along nicely, though we could use your strong back for the heavy lifting. Father says the new colt you helped birth before leaving has grown into quite the troublemaker, just like his father." The letter continued with news of village life, gossip about neighbors, updates on family members, and the carefully optimistic tone that marked correspondence from home. Margaret had read hundreds of such letters, each one a window into the ordinary lives that soldiers fought to preserve. When she finished, Sergeant Morrison lay quietly for several minutes, his eyes closed as he absorbed news from a world that felt increasingly distant and dreamlike. "Thank you, sister. You read it just like my Margaret would." "Your wife?" "Aye, 22 years this autumn. She's got a voice like music when she reads the evening papers." His expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll remember how to be a farmer when this is all over. Seems like all I know now is mud and bandages and the sound of artillery." Margaret understood his concern. The war changed everyone it touched, reshaping personalities and priorities in ways that wouldn't become clear until men attempted to return to their former lives. The lucky ones would find ways to integrate their experiences. Others would struggle with the transition for years. She moved to the next patient, a young corporal whose letter had arrived torn and partially illegible. Water damage had rendered several paragraphs unreadable. but enough remained to convey urgent news from home. "Sister, could you help me write a reply? My girl Sarah. She's expecting our first child, but the letter is dated 6 weeks ago. The baby might already be born." Margaret retrieved writing materials from the supply cabinet, settling beside his bed with paper and pen. These letters home required careful attention to military censorship rules, but they also demanded sensitivity to the emotional needs of men who might not survive to meet their children. "What would you like to tell her? That I love her, that I think about her every day, that I'm trying my best to come home to them both." His voice caught slightly on the last words. As Margaret helped him craft his response, other patients continued reading their own correspondence or sharing news with tentmates. The brief respite from medical routine allowed glimpses of the men they had been before the war claimed them, had husbands and fathers and sons who remembered other purposes beyond survival and duty. The Iron Cross lay heavy in Margaret's palm, its black and silver surface unmarked by the blood that had soaked through the German soldier's uniform. She had found it pinned to his jacket while cutting away fabric to access his wounds, and now the medal seemed to burn against her skin like a piece of hot metal. "Scheiße," the prisoner muttered through gritted teeth as Dr. Morrison probed the shrapnel embedded in his shoulder. Despite his obvious pain, the German maintained the rigid posture of a professional soldier, his grey eyes alert and calculating even in his weakened state. Margaret had treated enemy prisoners before, but never one who arrived so critically wounded alongside a convoy of British casualties. The ambulance driver had found him crawling away from a destroyed tank, leaving a trail of blood across a battlefield littered with the bodies of his comrades. "Sister Hayes," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "I need you to hold him steady while I extract this metal. The angle is tricky, and movement could sever the artery." She positioned herself beside the German's head, her hands firm against his shoulders. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially estimated, perhaps 25, with the kind of angular features that would have been handsome under different circumstances. A thin scar ran along his left cheek, evidence of previous combat experience. "Wie heißt du?" she asked in her limited German, remembering phrases from her school days. His eyes focused on her face with surprise. Klaus Hoffmann." His English carried a slight accent but remained clear and precise. "You speak German, sister?" "A little. Enough to know you're in considerable pain." Dr. Morrison worked carefully, his instruments clicking against metal as he maneuvered around vital blood vessels. The German, Klaus, tensed with each movement but made no sound beyond occasional sharp intakes of breath. Other medical staff moved through the tent with studied indifference, their training overriding personal feelings about treating enemy soldiers. But Margaret could sense the underlying tension, the way conversations quieted when they passed Klaus's bed, the barely concealed hostility in some of the orderlies' expressions. Sergeant Williams, recovering 2 beds away, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Seems a waste of good medical supplies, if you ask me. Jerry bastards killed half my unit last week." "That's enough, Sergeant," Margaret said firmly. "Every patient in this tent receives the same standard of care." "Easy for you to say, sister. You didn't watch your mates get cut down by machine gun fire from his lot." Klaus turned his head slightly toward the sound of Williams's voice. "I am sorry for your losses, Sergeant. War makes enemies of men who might have been friends in other circumstances." The unexpected apology created a moment of startled silence. Williams stared at the German with confusion, as if the concept of an enemy soldier expressing regret had never occurred to him. Dr. Morrison extracted the final piece of shrapnel and began suturing the wound. "He'll live, though that shoulder will give him trouble for the rest of his life, assuming he has a rest of his life." Margaret cleaned blood from her hands while considering the implications of the doctor's comment. Klaus would eventually be transferred to a prisoner of war camp, where his fate would depend on factors beyond anyone's immediate control. For now, though, he remained her patient and her responsibility. "The medal," Klaus said softly, noticing her examining the Iron Cross. "It belonged to my father. He received it in the last war." "Your father fought in the Great War against the British. Ironic, perhaps, that his son now depends on British medical care for survival." Margaret studied the medal more carefully, noting the inscription and the ribbon's faded colors. What would he think of this war? Klaus considered the question seriously, his expression growing distant. He would say that young men die for the ambitions of old men, regardless of which flag they carry. He spent 4 years in the trenches and came home believing that no cause justified such suffering. Yet you chose to serve. I chose to serve my country, sister. Perhaps I was naive to believe I could distinguish between patriotism and politics. He paused, wincing as Dr. Morrison tightened a suture. Your soldiers, they fight for the same reasons. Home, family, duty to their comrades. Margaret handed the Iron Cross back to him, noting how carefully he held it despite his wounded shoulder. The medal represented everything she had been taught to despise about the enemy, yet in Klaus's hands it seemed less like a symbol of Nazi ideology and more like a family heirloom connecting son to father across 2 devastating wars. I will keep it safe for you, she offered. Danke, thank you. He settled back against his pillow, exhaustion finally overcoming military bearing. Sister, may I ask something? What is it? Why do you treat me with such kindness? I am your enemy. Margaret considered her answer carefully, aware that other patients and staff were listening. Because beneath these uniforms, we're all just people trying to survive something bigger than ourselves. Your wounds bleed the same color as everyone else's. Klaus closed his eyes, but she could see the slight smile that crossed his features before sleep claimed him. Around the tent, the atmosphere had shifted subtly, hostility replaced by thoughtful silence as soldiers contemplated the humanity of their enemies. The empty morphine vial caught the harsh midday light as Margaret held it up to examine its clear glass surface. Not a drop remained of the precious pain medication that had been their last reserve, and 3 more ambulances were approaching from the front lines with their cargo of wounded men who would desperately need what she no longer had to give. Sister Hayes, Dr. Morrison's voice carried across the surgical tent with barely controlled urgency. We need morphine for the thoracic surgery, and I need it now. Margaret hurried to the supply cabinet, knowing what she would find, but hoping against reason that somehow additional vials had materialized overnight. The medical supplies had been running low for days, their requests for resupply delayed by German artillery targeting the supply routes. Doctor, we're completely out. The last vial went to the boy with the abdominal wounds 2 hours ago. Dr. Morrison paused in his examination of a sergeant whose chest had been opened by shrapnel, his hands still for a moment as he processed this information. Around them, the surgical tent hummed with desperate activity as 3 other doctors worked on cases that couldn't wait for better conditions. Then we proceed without it. Sister Catherine, I need you to hold him down. This is going to be unpleasant. The sergeant, a career soldier named Patterson, had remained conscious throughout his transport from the battlefield. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. How bad is it, Doc? Bad enough that lying to you won't help anyone, Doctor. Morrison replied with the brutal honesty that battlefield medicine demanded. I can save you, but it's going to hurt like nothing you've ever experienced. Patterson nodded grimly, understanding the bargain being offered. Margaret positioned herself at his head, ready to provide whatever comfort was possible during surgery without anesthesia. Talk to me, sister, Patterson whispered as Dr. Morrison began the procedure. Tell me about something beautiful. Margaret searched her memory for images that might transport him away from this tent of pain and suffering. There's a garden behind my childhood home in Kent. Every spring, my mother would plant roses along the stone wall that separated our property from the meadow. Pink ones, white ones, deep red varieties that bloomed twice each season. Her voice remained steady as Dr. Morrison worked, though she could feel Patterson's body tense with each probe of the surgical instruments. Other patients in nearby beds turned away, unable to watch the procedure that any of them might face if supplies remained scarce. The roses attracted butterflies, Margaret continued, her words flowing automatically, while her hands provided steady pressure to keep Patterson immobilized. Cabbage whites and painted ladies, sometimes monarchs during their autumn migration. I used to sit on the garden bench for hours, watching them move from bloom to bloom. Patterson's breathing grew more labored as the surgery progressed, but he remained conscious, drawing strength from her descriptions of a world where beauty still existed without the threat of sudden death. A commotion near the tent entrance interrupted Margaret's narrative. Klaus, the German prisoner, had managed to sit up in his bed despite his wounded shoulder, speaking rapidly in English to one of the orderlies. "What's the problem?" Margaret called across the tent. "The Jerry says he's got medical training," the orderly replied with obvious skepticism. "Claims he can help with the surgery." Dr. Morrison looked up from his work, surgical instruments still in hand. "What kind of training?" Klaus struggled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "University of Berlin Medical School, 3 years before the war. I served as field medic with my unit." The offer hung in the air like smoke, visible but difficult to grasp completely. Accepting help from an enemy prisoner violated every conventional understanding of wartime protocol, yet the desperate circumstances made conventional wisdom seem like an unaffordable luxury. "Can you work with that shoulder?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Well enough to assist, and I know techniques for surgery without morphine. We have faced similar shortages." Margaret watched the silent communication that passed between doctor and prisoner, two medical professionals recognizing each other across the artificial boundaries of nationality and allegiance. "Show me," Dr. Morrison said finally. Klaus moved carefully to the surgical table, his movements economical despite his injury. He examined Patterson's wounds with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar trauma, then began speaking quietly with Dr. Morrison about pressure points and nerve blocks that could reduce pain without pharmaceutical intervention. "This will help," Klaus said, positioning his hands carefully along Patterson's spine. Ancient technique, but effective when properly applied. As Klaus worked, Margaret noticed other patients watching with fascination rather than hostility. The German's obvious medical competence and gentle manner with Patterson seemed to override their trained hatred of the enemy. "Better?" Klaus asked Patterson, who nodded with obvious relief. "Much better, thank you." The collaboration continued as Dr. Morrison completed the surgery, Klaus providing assistance that clearly came from extensive training and experience. By the time they finished, Patterson was stable and conscious, his breathing steady for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Margaret held the empty morphine vial once more, realizing that sometimes the most valuable medicine came not from glass containers, but from unexpected sources of human compassion. The school exercise book lay open on the small table beside the bed, its pages filled with careful handwriting that spoke of mathematics lessons and history essays rather than battlefield strategy. Margaret had found it in the young soldier's breast pocket while treating his wounds, and now the innocent contents seemed to mock the reality of his presence in this place of adult horror. "Please, miss," the boy whispered, his voice high and trembling with pain, "don't tell them how old I am. They'll send me home in disgrace." Private Tommy Wright claimed to be 19, but the exercise book told a different story. Inside the front cover, written in a schoolmaster's precise hand, were the words, "Thomas Wright, Form 5, B Street, Edmonds Grammar School, age 16. The date indicated he should still be attending classes, not bleeding from shrapnel wounds in a French field hospital. Margaret cleaned the deep gash across his forehead while studying his face more carefully. Beneath the mud and stubble that he'd cultivated to appear older, she could see the soft features of adolescence. His hands, when not clenched with pain, showed the calluses of farm work, but lacked the weathered appearance that came with years of adult labor. "Tommy," she said gently, using his given name rather than his rank, "how did you manage to enlist?" "Told them I was 19. Said I'd lost my birth certificate in the London bombing." He winced as she applied antiseptic to his wounds. "Wasn't entirely a lie about the bombing. Our house did take a hit, and most of our papers were destroyed." The admission carried the defensive tone of someone who had convinced himself that necessity justified deception. Margaret had encountered similar cases before, boys who lied about their age to escape poverty, to follow older brothers into service, or simply to participate in what they perceived as a grand adventure. "Your parents, do they know where you are?" Tommy's expression crumpled, the careful facade of military bearing dissolving into the grief of a child separated from everything familiar. "Mum thinks I'm working at the munitions factory in Birmingham." I send her part of my army pay and tell her it's factory wages. Margaret examined the exercise book more closely, while Tommy dozed fitfully under the influence of the small amount of sedative they could spare. The pages revealed a conscientious student's work, 1905, algebraic equations solved with methodical precision, an essay about the Norman conquest that demonstrated genuine historical understanding, geometry problems accompanied by careful diagrams. On the final page, someone had written a poem in the same careful handwriting that filled the rest of the book. The verses described spring mornings in the English countryside, with imagery that spoke of intimate familiarity with rural landscapes. It was signed, "For Mother, with love from your devoted son, Tommy." Sister Hayes. Dr. Morrison approached quietly, clipboard in hand. "How's our young patient?" "Physically, he'll recover completely. The head wound looks worse than it is, and the leg injury should heal without permanent damage." Margaret closed the exercise book carefully. "Emotionally, that's another matter entirely." Dr. Morrison glanced at the book, understanding immediately what it represented. "How old do you think he really is?" 16, according to his school records. Possibly 17 by now, but certainly not the 19 he claims. They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications. Military regulations required that underage soldiers be returned to their families, but the process involved paperwork, investigations, and potential criminal charges for the boy who had lied about his age. "What do you recommend?" Dr. Morrison asked. Margaret looked at Tommy's sleeping face, noting how young he appeared when not trying to project adult toughness. "Give him time to heal, physically and emotionally. Then help him find a way to serve that doesn't involve lying about who he is." Tommy stirred, his eyes opening with the confused disorientation common to head injuries. For a moment, he looked around the tent without recognition, his gaze settling on Margaret with the trust that children instinctively place in maternal figures. "Nurse, I had the strangest dream. I thought I was back in school, sitting for my final examinations." His voice carried the wondering tone of someone struggling to distinguish memory from hallucination. "Perhaps it wasn't entirely a dream," Margaret said gently, helping him sit up to sip water from a tin cup. "Sometimes our minds take us back to safer places when the present becomes too difficult to bear." As Tommy became more alert, she watched him consciously rebuild the persona of Private Wright, 19-year-old soldier. His posture straightened, his voice deepened slightly, and his expression took on the carefully neutral mask that young men wore when trying to prove their maturity to skeptical adults. But the exercise book remained on the table beside his bed, a tangible reminder of the childhood he had abandoned in his desperate attempt to participate in an adult war that had already claimed too many young lives. The German medical kit gleamed with efficiency that put their own makeshift supplies to shame. Klaus had produced it from his personal effects, revealing instruments and medications that the British field hospital hadn't seen in weeks. Margaret examined the contents with professional admiration, mixed with frustration at the disparity in resources. "Your medical corps is better supplied than ours," she observed, lifting a pristine surgical clamp from its fitted compartment. Klaus managed a weak smile from his hospital bed. "German engineering extends to medical equipment. We believe in precision, even in war." He gestured toward the kit with his uninjured arm. "Please, use whatever you need. These supplies serve no purpose if they remain unused." Dr. Morrison approached, drawn by Margaret's examination of the unfamiliar instruments. His eyes widened as he inventoried the kit's contents: sulfur powder, morphine ampules, surgical thread, and antiseptics in quantities they hadn't possessed in days. "This changes everything," he murmured, lifting a sealed packet of sterile bandages. "We can actually perform proper surgery again." Klaus observed their reaction with something approaching satisfaction. "In my unit, I served as sanitator, medical corpsman. I carried advanced supplies because tank crews often work far from medical support." Margaret found herself reassessing the man who had been simply the German prisoner hours earlier. His medical knowledge, evident from his assistance with Patterson's surgery, combined with these superior supplies, transformed him from burden to asset. "Klaus," she said, testing the familiarity of his given name, Would you be willing to teach us some of your techniques? We've been improvising for weeks." He nodded eagerly, the opportunity to contribute clearly appealing to his professional pride. "I would be honored. Medicine should know no borders." Word of the German medical supplies spread quickly through the hospital staff. Sister Catherine arrived within minutes, followed by the other nurses and several orderlies. Klaus found himself the center of attention as medical personnel gathered around his bed. "Show us the nerve block technique you used earlier," Dr. Morrison requested. "Our anatomy training covered the theory, but we lack practical experience." Klaus struggled to sit up, wincing as movement aggravated his shoulder wound. "I will demonstrate on myself if someone assists with positioning." He looked directly at Margaret. "Sister Hayes, would you help?" She positioned Klaus carefully, supporting his injured shoulder while he indicated specific pressure points along the spine and neck. His explanations came in precise English, occasionally supplemented with German medical terms that the doctors recognized from their university training. "Here, you see the cervical vertebrae alignment? Slight pressure at this angle interrupts pain signals without affecting motor function." Klaus guided Margaret's fingers to the correct position. "In field conditions, this technique can replace morphine for minor procedures." Dr. Morrison practiced the technique under Klaus's instruction, his movements becoming more confident as he understood the anatomical principles involved. Other staff members observed closely, recognizing knowledge that could save lives when pharmaceutical supplies ran short. Private Patterson, the patient who had benefited from Klaus's earlier intervention, watched from his nearby bed with obvious interest. "Jerry knows his business. I'll give him that," he commented to his neighbor. "Feels like magic when he works those pressure points." The comment sparked broader conversation among the recovering patients. Several men who had initially viewed Klaus with suspicion began asking questions about German medical practices, their hostility gradually replaced by professional curiosity. "Do all German medics receive this training?" asked Corporal Henderson, the Yorkshire soldier whose leg was healing well. "Only those assigned to forward units," Klaus replied. "Tank crews, reconnaissance teams, special operations. We must be prepared to work without support for extended periods." As the afternoon progressed, Klaus continued sharing techniques that addressed common battlefield medical challenges. He demonstrated improved methods for controlling hemorrhaging, described herbal treatments for infection when antibiotics weren't available, and explained diagnostic procedures that could be performed without sophisticated equipment. Margaret found herself taking notes, recognizing that Klaus's knowledge represented years of practical experience that could benefit every patient they treated. His willingness to share this expertise, despite being their prisoner, challenged her assumptions about enemy motivations and character. "Why are you helping us?" she asked during a quiet moment between demonstrations. Klaus considered the question seriously, his grey eyes reflecting the weight of decisions that had brought him to this moment. "Because healing is more important than politics, sister. When I studied medicine in Berlin, my professors spoke of the physician's oath to preserve life regardless of nationality or allegiance." He paused, looking around the tent at British soldiers who were beginning to see him as something other than an enemy. "Perhaps if more soldiers remembered that we share common humanity beneath different uniforms, wars would end sooner." The German medical kit remained open on the table beside his bed, its contents now integrated into the hospital's supply system. But more than equipment had been shared that day: knowledge, respect, and recognition that healing transcended the artificial boundaries that politicians drew between peoples. As evening approached, Klaus settled back against his pillow, exhausted by the day's activities, but visibly satisfied by his contributions to the medical mission that had become their shared purpose. The Field Bible's leather cover bore the scars of countless battlefield services, its pages marked with mud stains and the salt residue of tears shed over dying soldiers. Chaplain Thomas Morrison carried it in his breast pocket, close to his heart, where shrapnel had once come within inches of ending his ministry permanently. "Good afternoon, Sister Hayes," he said quietly, removing his cap as he entered the recovery tent. At 38, Thomas had the prematurely grey hair and lined face of someone who had provided spiritual comfort to too many young men facing death far from home. Margaret looked up from changing Private Patterson's dressings, noting how the chaplain's presence seemed to ease the tension that perpetually filled the medical tents. Soldiers who rarely spoke of faith found themselves drawn to this gentle man who offered hope without judgment. "Chaplain Morrison, the men will be glad to see you." Thomas moved through the tent with practiced efficiency, stopping at each bed to offer a few words of comfort or encouragement. His approach varied depending on the patient's condition and apparent spiritual needs, sometimes sharing scripture, other times simply listening to concerns about families left behind. He paused longest beside young Tommy Wright, whose school exercise book still lay on the bedside table. The boy soldier had been struggling with nightmares since his head injury, calling out for his mother during episodes of delirium. "How are you feeling today, son?" Tommy's eyes focused with effort, the lingering effects of his concussion making concentration difficult. "Better, sir. Sister Hayes says the headaches should stop soon." Thomas settled into the chair beside the bed, his movements deliberate and calming. "I understand you've been having some troubled sleep. Would you like to talk about what's bothering you?" For a moment, Tommy's carefully constructed adult facade wavered, revealing the frightened child beneath. "I keep dreaming that I'm back home, sitting in church with my mum. But then the dream changes, and I'm here, and there's blood everywhere, and she's asking why I lied to her." Margaret continued her work with other patients while listening to the conversation, recognizing the therapeutic value of confession for soldiers carrying burdens too heavy for their years. "Guilt is a heavy weight for anyone to carry," Thomas said gently, opening his Bible to a passage marked with a faded ribbon. "But it's especially difficult for someone your age to bear alone. You know how old I really am. I suspect you're younger than your enlistment papers indicate. But age isn't always measured in years, son. Sometimes circumstances force us to grow up faster than nature intended." Thomas read quietly from Psalms, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone comfortable with scripture. The words seemed to soothe not only Tommy but other patients within hearing range, creating a pocket of peace within the tense atmosphere of medical urgency. When he finished reading, Thomas closed the Bible and looked directly at Tommy. "Would you like me to write to your mother? Sometimes it's easier for a chaplain to explain difficult situations to worried families." The offer hung in the air like morning mist, visible but delicate. Tommy considered the possibility of honest communication with his family, weighing his fear of disappointment against his desperate longing for connection with home. What would you tell her? The truth. That her son is serving his country with courage and honor, that he's been injured but is recovering well, and that he thinks of her every day. Margaret noticed Klaus watching the interaction from his bed across the tent, his expression thoughtful as he observed the chaplain's gentle ministry. When Thomas moved in his direction, the German prisoner straightened slightly, uncertain of the reception he might receive. "Good afternoon," Thomas said simply, extending the same courtesy he offered to every patient regardless of nationality. "Good afternoon, chaplain. I am Klaus Hoffmann. I know who you are. I also know that you've been helping our medical staff save lives. That speaks well of your character." Klaus seemed surprised by the lack of hostility in the chaplain's manner. "In my country, military chaplains rarely speak to enemy prisoners with such kindness." "Perhaps that's part of the problem," Thomas replied, settling beside Klaus's bed. "Faith should build bridges, not walls." Margaret watched as Thomas opened his Bible once more, this time reading in what she recognized as German. Klaus's eyes widened with amazement at hearing scripture in his native language. "Mein Gott," Klaus whispered, "how do you know German scripture?" "Seminary training included classical languages. I find that comfort translates better in one's mother tongue." The afternoon continued with Thomas moving between patients, offering prayer, reading scripture, and simply providing the human connection that soldiers needed as much as medical treatment. The antique pocket watch ticked steadily in Dr. Morrison's vest pocket, its golden surface worn smooth by decades of anxious handling during critical procedures. His grandfather had carried it through the Boer War, timing everything from artillery barrages to emergency amputations. And now it measured the precious minutes that meant the difference between life and death in a Normandy field hospital. "Incoming casualties," The shout echoed across the compound as 3 ambulances roared through the perimeter, their engines straining under the weight of urgent cargo. Margaret could hear the drivers calling for immediate assistance before their vehicles had even stopped moving. Dr. Morrison pulled out the pocket watch, checking the time with practiced efficiency. 14:30 hours. Mark it, Sister Hayes. We'll need precise timing for the surgical log. The first stretcher emerged from the lead ambulance carrying a major whose chest rose and fell in irregular gasps. Blood soaked through multiple layers of field dressings, and his complexion had taken on the greyish pallor that Margaret had learned to associate with massive internal bleeding. Penetrating abdominal trauma, the ambulance medic reported breathlessly. Artillery shell fragment, approximately 10 centimeters, still embedded, pulse dropping steadily during transport. Dr. Morrison examined the major quickly, his hands moving with the confident precision that came from months of battlefield surgery. Prep him for immediate operation. Sister Catherine, I need the surgical tent cleared and ready in 5 minutes. Margaret helped transfer the major to a surgical table while other staff members prepared equipment with practiced urgency. Around them, the controlled chaos of mass casualty response unfolded as nurses triaged additional patients and orderlies organized supplies. Sister Hayes, Dr. Morrison called, I need you to assist directly. This one requires 4 hands and perfect timing. She scrubbed quickly at the wash station, her movements automatic after countless similar procedures. Through the tent opening, she could see Klaus observing the preparations with professional interest, his medical knowledge making him acutely aware of the challenges they faced. Klaus, doctor, Morrison called unexpectedly. Can you assist from your bed? We need someone to monitor vital signs and call out any changes. The German prisoner struggled to position himself where he could observe the patient clearly. I am ready, doctor. What baseline measurements do you need? Dr. Morrison consulted his pocket watch once more before beginning the procedure. Pulse rate 72 and falling, blood pressure dropping. We have perhaps 20 minutes before circulatory collapse becomes irreversible. Margaret positioned herself opposite the doctor, their coordination refined through dozens of similar operations. The major's breathing grew more labored as the anesthesia took effect, his body's struggle to maintain circulation evident in every shallow breath. Beginning primary incision, Dr. Morrison announced, his scalpel moving with surgical precision. Klaus, call out pulse changes immediately. Pulse 70, steady for now, Klaus responded, his voice carrying the authority of medical training despite his position as prisoner. Margaret anticipated each of Dr. Morrison's requirements, passing instruments before he could request them, maintaining visibility with careful positioning of the surgical lamps. The shrapnel had penetrated deeply, damaging multiple organs while narrowly missing major blood vessels. 16 minutes elapsed, Dr. Morrison noted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. How's our patient, Klaus? Pulse dropping to 65, blood pressure showing signs of stabilization. The delicate work continued as Dr. Morrison removed metal fragments while repairing damaged tissue. Margaret found herself holding retractors at impossible angles, her arms aching from maintaining precise positioning that allowed the doctor to work in the cramped surgical space. Complications, Dr. Morrison announced suddenly. The fragment nicked the hepatic artery. Sister Hayes, I need immediate pressure here while I attempt repair. Margaret's hands moved without conscious thought, applying pressure exactly where needed while Dr. Morrison worked to control the bleeding. Around them, other patients waited for attention, but this moment demanded complete focus on saving one life before moving to the next. Pulse 60 and holding, Klaus called. Patient appears to be stabilizing. 22 minutes, Dr. Morrison noted, checking his pocket watch again. We're pushing the limits of what his system can tolerate. The repair work required another 15 minutes of meticulous suturing, each stitch precisely placed to ensure proper healing while minimizing future complications. Margaret marveled at Dr. Morrison's steady hands, his ability to perform microsurgery under conditions that would challenge the best civilian hospitals. Arterial repair complete, Dr. Morrison announced, beginning closure. Klaus, how are we doing? Pulse strengthening to 68, color improving. I believe we have success. Margaret assisted with the final sutures. her relief evident as the major's breathing became more regular and his complexion began to improve. The surgery had pushed everyone involved to their limits, but teamwork had prevailed over seemingly impossible odds. "Time, Doctor?" Morrison asked as he completed the final stitch. Margaret checked the pocket watch, which he had placed on the instrument table for easy reference. 15:27. Total surgical time, 57 minutes. Dr. Morrison nodded with satisfaction, noting the time in his surgical log. "Excellent work, everyone. Sister Hayes, monitor him closely for the next 4 hours. Klaus, thank you for your assistance. Your observations were invaluable." As they transferred the major to recovery, Margaret reflected on the collaboration that had made success possible. 3 people from different backgrounds and opposing armies had worked together seamlessly, united by their shared commitment to preserving life. The pocket watch continued its steady rhythm, marking time that would allow the major to recover, return to his family, and perhaps reconsider the true meaning of victory in a war that seemed increasingly senseless to those who witnessed its daily cost in human suffering. The pressed flower lay between the pages of Margaret's journal, like a fragment of another world, its purple petals flattened and preserved from a spring morning that seemed impossibly distant from this place of suffering. She had picked it from her mother's garden the day before leaving England, a violet that had bloomed beside the kitchen window where she had eaten breakfast as a child. Margaret sat on an overturned ammunition crate behind the medical tents, stealing a few precious moments of solitude while the afternoon lull allowed her colleagues to rest. The successful surgery on the major had drained everyone's energy, and Dr. Morrison had insisted that all staff take brief breaks to prevent the exhaustion that led to medical errors. She opened her journal carefully, revealing the pressed violet alongside pages of observations written in her neat handwriting. Each entry documented not just medical procedures and patient conditions, but her own emotional responses to the daily horror that had become routine. "Today I watched Klaus teach our doctors techniques that saved a man's life," she wrote, her pen moving slowly across the paper. "6 months ago, I would have seen only the enemy uniform. Now I see a fellow healer who shares our commitment to preserving life despite the madness that surrounds us." The violet seemed to pulse with color against the stark white page, reminding her of peaceful mornings when her greatest concern was choosing which dress to wear to church services. That innocent woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known briefly before war transformed her into this harder, more capable version of herself. A shadow fell across her journal as Sister Catherine approached, moving with the careful steps of someone whose feet had carried her through too many 18-hour shifts. "Mind if I join you, dear? These old bones need a rest." Margaret shifted to make room on the makeshift bench they had constructed from salvaged materials. Catherine settled beside her with a grateful sigh, removing her cap to allow the afternoon breeze to cool her grey hair. "What are you writing about today?" "Everything. Nothing. The way Klaus helped during surgery. How young Tommy still calls for his mother in his sleep. Whether any of us will remember how to live normal lives when this is over." Catherine nodded, understanding the need to process experiences that exceeded normal human capacity for absorption. "I kept a journal during the last war. Thought it might help me make sense of all the death and suffering. Did it help? Not the way I expected, but reading those pages years later helped me understand how much I had grown, how much strength I had discovered that I never knew I possessed." Margaret touched the pressed violet gently, feeling its papery texture through the journal page. "I picked this flower the morning I left home. Seems foolish now, carrying a piece of my mother's garden into a war zone. Not foolish at all. We all need reminders of what we're fighting to preserve." Catherine's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had survived one war and was determined to survive another. "Beauty doesn't disappear just because ugliness surrounds us. Sometimes we have to look harder to find it, but it's always there." Through the tent walls, they could hear the murmur of conversation as patients shared stories and jokes, their voices carrying the particular camaraderie that developed among men who had faced death together. Even Klaus's accented English had become part of the conversation, his medical insights earning grudging respect from soldiers who had initially viewed him with suspicion. "Do you think Klaus will survive the war?" Margaret asked. Catherine considered the question seriously. Physically, yes. His wounds are healing well, and he's young enough to recover completely. Emotionally, that's harder to predict. Being a prisoner changes a man, especially one who was trained to heal rather than kill. Margaret closed her journal carefully, preserving the violet between its pages. The flower would eventually crumble to dust, but for now it served as tangible proof that gentleness still existed in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything soft and beautiful. "I should check on the patients," she said, rising from the crate. "Margaret," Catherine called softly, "don't lose that flower. When this war ends, you'll need to remember what peace looks like." As Margaret returned to the medical tents, she carried with her the image of the pressed violet and the memory of her mother's garden. These fragments of beauty would sustain her through whatever horrors the remaining hours might bring, reminding her that healing was ultimately about restoring wholeness to a broken world. The unfinished letter to her sister lay crumpled on Margaret's small writing desk, its incomplete sentences bearing witness to the impossible task of conveying truth while navigating military censorship. She had started it 3 times, each attempt failing to bridge the chasm between her daily reality and what civilians could safely be allowed to understand. "My dearest Elizabeth," the latest draft began, "I hope this letter finds you and the children well. Life here continues, much as I described in my previous correspondence, though I cannot provide details that might concern the family unnecessarily." Margaret stared at the inadequate words, knowing that Elizabeth would read between the lines and worry anyway. Her sister possessed the intuitive understanding that came from growing up together, sharing secrets and fears that no amount of careful phrasing could completely disguise. The truth was impossible to write, that she had held dying boys while they called for mothers who would never see them again, that she had watched Klaus teach British doctors how to perform surgery without anesthesia, that young Tommy Wright still woke screaming from nightmares about battles that someone his age should never have witnessed. "The weather has been quite pleasant," she continued, then crossed out the sentence immediately. Pleasant seemed like a mockery when shells exploded within earshot every few hours, when the ground around their compound bore craters from near misses that could have killed them all. A knock on her tent pole interrupted her frustrated writing attempts. Chaplain Morrison stood at the entrance, his expression gentle but concerned. "Sister Hayes, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Dr. Morrison mentioned that you seemed troubled during afternoon rounds." Margaret gestured to the chair beside her desk, grateful for company that might help distract her from the impossible task of honest communication with home. "I'm trying to write to my sister, but every word feels like a lie. How do you tell someone you love that you're witnessing horrors that would give them nightmares without actually telling them anything at all?" Thomas settled into the chair, his understanding evident in the way he nodded. "I struggle with the same problem when writing to my congregation back home. They want to know I'm safe and serving God's purpose, but they can't comprehend the reality of trying to find divine meaning in all this suffering. Do you ever question whether we're making any difference here? Whether all this death and pain serves any purpose beyond feeding the ambitions of politicians who will never set foot on a battlefield?" The chaplain was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered her question. "Every day. But then I see Klaus teaching our doctors how to save lives, or watch you comfort a dying soldier, or witness the way men from different backgrounds support each other in this tent. Those moments convince me that we're preserving something essential about human dignity." Margaret picked up her pen again, attempting another approach to her letter. "Elizabeth, I wish I could share with you the remarkable courage I witness daily. The men here face impossible circumstances with grace and humor that would humble anyone who knows them. I am privileged to serve alongside such extraordinary people." This felt more honest, if still incomplete. Elizabeth would understand that courage meant danger, that extraordinary circumstances suggested suffering beyond normal experience. "Tell me about your sister," Thomas asked, apparently sensing her need to talk about family rather than war. "Elizabeth is 3 years older, married with 2 children. She teaches at the village school and worries constantly about everyone except herself." Margaret smiled at memories of her sister's protective nature. "She tried to talk me out of volunteering for field service, said I was too sensitive for battlefield work. Was she right?" Margaret considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman who had arrived in Normandy 6 months ago, compared to the person she had become through daily exposure to trauma and loss. The sensitive woman who left England couldn't have functioned here for a week, but sensitivity isn't weakness if you learn to channel it properly. Klaus showed me that when he helped save the Major's life despite being our prisoner, Tommy Wright demonstrates it every time he comforts another patient, despite being barely more than a child himself. She returned to her letter, finding words that felt closer to truth without violating censorship requirements. The work here has taught me that healing requires both professional skill and personal compassion. I am learning to be stronger than I ever imagined possible, while still maintaining the gentleness that drew me to nursing in the first place. Thomas read over her shoulder, nodding approval. That's beautifully expressed. Your sister will understand the growth you're describing, even if she can't know the specific experiences that created it. Margaret sealed the letter before she could second-guess its contents again, addressing it carefully and adding it to the pile of outgoing mail that would eventually reach England if enemy action didn't intercept the transport. The shattered medical gauge lay in pieces across the tent floor, its glass face spider-webbed from the concussion of a shell that had exploded barely 50 meters from the surgical tent. Margaret stared at the broken instrument, which moments before had been monitoring a patient's blood pressure with mechanical precision, now reduced to useless fragments by the arbitrary violence of war. Incoming artillery. The sentry's warning cut through the evening air just seconds before the first shell screamed overhead, its passage marked by a sound like tearing fabric, amplified beyond human comprehension. Margaret threw herself across young Tommy Wright's bed, shielding him with her body as the explosion sent shockwaves through the ground beneath them. Around the tent, other patients who could move sought whatever cover was available, while those too injured to relocate lay helpless in their beds, eyes wide with terror. "Stay down!" Dr. Morrison shouted from across the tent, his voice barely audible above the whistling approach of additional shells. "Everyone remain calm and stay low." Klaus struggled to roll from his bed onto the floor, his wounded shoulder making movement difficult, but his survival instincts overriding physical limitations. "Sister Hayes," he called urgently, "move the patients away from the tent walls. Shrapnel penetrates canvas easily." Margaret began helping mobile patients relocate toward the center of the tent, where structural support poles offered minimal protection but better odds than remaining exposed near the perimeter. Tommy Wright clung to her arm with the desperate grip of someone who had seen too much death for his 16 years. "Is this how it ends?" he whispered, his young voice cracking with fear. "No," Margaret replied firmly, projecting confidence she didn't feel. "This is just another storm to weather. We've survived worse." The lie came easily, born from months of practice in maintaining morale during impossible circumstances. Truth was that direct hits on medical facilities, while technically violations of international law, occurred regularly when artillery crews couldn't distinguish between legitimate military targets and protected medical areas. Another shell exploded closer, its concussion shattering additional equipment and sending medical supplies cascading from overturned tables. The broken gauge's remains crunched underfoot as Margaret moved between patients, checking for injuries caused by flying debris. "Anyone hurt from the blast effects?" she called out, conducting rapid visual assessments while shells continued falling around them. Sergeant Patterson, still recovering from his successful surgery, had managed to crawl beneath his bed frame. "Just scared senseless, sister. But that's nothing new in this bloody war." Dr. Morrison emerged from behind an overturned cabinet where he had taken shelter. "Medical supplies are scattered but mostly intact. We can continue operations if this barrage stops soon." Klaus raised his head cautiously, scanning the tent for damage assessment. "In my experience, evening bombardments typically last 15 to 20 minutes. Enough to disrupt operations but not long enough to require major artillery repositioning." His clinical analysis of enemy tactics would have seemed treasonous under different circumstances, but surrounded by wounded men who faced immediate danger, practical knowledge trumped political considerations. "How do you know so much about British artillery patterns?" Corporal Henderson asked, his Yorkshire accent thick with suspicion that hadn't entirely disappeared, despite Klaus's medical contributions. Because we studied your methods extensively during training. Know your enemy's capabilities, and you improve your chances of survival. Klaus's response carried no boastfulness, only the matter-of-fact tone of a professional soldier sharing tactical information. Margaret continued moving among the patients, offering comfort and checking for blast-related injuries, while shells exploded in a steady rhythm around their position. The Germans' prediction proved accurate, as the bombardment maintained consistent intensity without seeming to target their specific location. Tommy Wright had crawled under his bed beside Sergeant Patterson, both men finding odd comfort in shared vulnerability. "Sarge, do you think we'll make it through this one?" "Lad, I've been through 3 major bombardments since landing in Normandy. Still here, aren't I?" Patterson's gruff voice carried genuine reassurance despite his own obvious fear. "Jerry's got bigger targets than a field hospital tonight." As if summoned by his words, a shell exploded close enough to spray dirt through the tent opening, followed by the acrid smell of cordite and burning vegetation. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments when death seemed only seconds away. "Everyone remain calm," she called out, her voice steady despite internal turmoil. "This will pass." Klaus had managed to position himself where he could observe the tent's structural integrity during the bombardment. The support framework is holding well. British engineering appears quite solid. His attempt at humor drew nervous laughter from several patients, the absurdity of an enemy prisoner critiquing their tent construction, providing momentary relief from terror. The shelling continued for another 10 minutes before gradually tapering off, the intervals between explosions growing longer until silence finally returned to the evening air. Margaret counted 30 seconds of quiet before allowing herself to believe the immediate danger had passed. "All clear," Dr. Morrison announced, emerging from cover to assess damage and casualties. "Everyone check yourselves and your neighbors for injuries." Margaret surveyed the tent, noting scattered supplies and broken equipment, but no serious injuries among patients or staff. The shattered medical gauge served as a reminder of how quickly their carefully organized medical facility could be reduced to chaos by forces beyond their control. As normal operations gradually resumed, she swept up the gauge's broken glass, each fragment reflecting lamplight like tiny stars scattered across the tent floor. The silver locket felt warm in Margaret's palm as Colonel Whitmore pressed it into her hands with fingers that shook from more than just his mortal wounds. Inside the delicate oval case, a photograph showed a young woman with gentle eyes holding 2 small children, their faces bright with the innocent happiness of a family portrait taken before war shattered their world. "Promise me," the colonel whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the tent around them. "Promise, you'll see that my wife receives this, along with my final words." Margaret nodded, closing her fingers carefully around the locket. Colonel Whitmore had arrived 20 minutes earlier, carried in by stretcher-bearers who knew from his wounds that time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Shrapnel from a direct mortar hit had torn through his abdomen and chest, and Dr. Morrison's examination had confirmed what they all understood without speaking. "Tell me about them," Margaret said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. Around them, other patients lay quietly, understanding that they were witnessing a man's final conversation with the world. "Sarah. My wife's name is Sarah. We've been married 12 years this October." His eyes focused on the tent ceiling, but Margaret could see he was looking beyond it, to memories that provided more comfort than present circumstances. "Those are our children, Michael and Catherine, 8 and 6 years old." Margaret opened the locket again, studying the faces of people she would never meet, but whose lives would be forever changed by this moment. The woman's smile suggested complete confidence in her husband's eventual return, the innocent faith of someone who had never imagined permanent loss. "What would you like me to tell Sarah?" Colonel Whitmore's breathing grew more labored as he considered the question, his military training warring with his desire to express emotion that career soldiers were taught to suppress. "Tell her that I thought of her every day, that, even in the worst moments, remembering her smile gave me strength to continue." He paused, gathering energy for words that would serve as his final testament. "Tell her that I'm proud of the life we built together and that raising our children was my greatest accomplishment." Margaret transcribed his words carefully in her notebook, understanding that precision mattered when carrying final messages from the dying to the living. These sentences would be read countless times, analyzed for hidden meanings, treasured as the last communication from a man who would never speak again. "The children," he continued, his voice growing weaker, "tell Michael that being his father was the greatest honor of my life. Tell Catherine that she has her mother's kindness and intelligence, and that I expect great things from her." Klaus had been listening from his nearby bed, his medical knowledge making him acutely aware of the colonel's deteriorating condition. "Sister," he said quietly, "perhaps we should summon the chaplain. Time may be shorter than we hope." Margaret nodded, signaling to an orderly who disappeared to find Chaplain Morrison. The colonel's eyes followed this exchange, understanding the implications without needing explicit explanation. "There's something else," he said urgently, as if sensing approaching unconsciousness. "In my breast pocket, there's a letter I wrote to Sarah 3 days ago. I meant to post it, but we were called to the front before I could arrange delivery." Margaret retrieved the letter, noting how the colonel's careful handwriting had become less steady as he composed what would unknowingly be his final written communication with his wife. The envelope bore Sarah's address in a village near Canterbury, along with a return address that would soon become obsolete. "Read it to me," he requested. "I want to hear her name spoken aloud one more time." Margaret opened the letter carefully, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet tent as other patients listened with the respectful attention that accompanied last words. "My dearest Sarah, another day passes without seeing your beautiful face, but I carry you with me in every moment. The photograph you gave me has sustained me through difficulties I cannot describe in letters that must pass through censorship. Know that you are my anchor in this storm, my reminder of everything worth fighting to preserve." The colonel's eyes closed as she read, a slight smile crossing his features as familiar words transported him beyond the confines of pain and approaching death. Chaplain Morrison arrived as Margaret finished reading, his presence bringing the spiritual comfort that soldiers often needed more than medical intervention during their final moments. "Colonel," Thomas said gently, "I'm here if you'd like to pray together." "Yes, for my family, for all the men who won't be going home." Margaret held the locket throughout the brief prayer, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with becoming the bearer of last words and precious possessions. When the colonel's breathing finally stopped 20 minutes later, she remained sitting beside his bed for several additional minutes, honoring the man who had entrusted her with his final gift to the family that would mourn his loss for the rest of their lives. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the tent walls as Margaret adjusted its wick for optimal illumination during the approaching night shift. The brass fixture had belonged to her grandmother, carried from England as a practical reminder of home, and now it served as the primary light source for nighttime medical procedures when electrical generators failed or required maintenance. "Sister Hayes," Dr. Morrison called from the supply cabinet, "are you certain about volunteering for night duty? You've been working since dawn, and exhaustion leads to medical errors." Margaret tested the lamp's flame, ensuring steady combustion that would last through the long hours ahead. "I'm fine, Doctor. Besides, someone needs to monitor the patients we treated today, and Sister Catherine deserves proper rest after yesterday's emergency surgeries." The transition from day to night operations always required careful preparation. Lighting became critical when treating wounds or administering medications, and the reduced staff meant that remaining personnel needed to be especially alert for changes in patient conditions. Tommy Wright had improved significantly since his head injury, though he still experienced occasional dizzy spells that made him unsteady on his feet. "Sister, will you be here all night? I sleep better knowing you're nearby." "I'll be right here, Tommy. Try to get some rest." Klaus observed the night preparations with professional interest, his medical training making him aware of the additional challenges that darkness brought to battlefield medicine. "Sister, in my unit we use specific techniques for low-light medical procedures. Would you like me to share what I learned?" Margaret considered his offer, recognizing that pride shouldn't prevent her from accepting knowledge that might help save lives. "What kind of techniques?" positioning patients to maximize available light, organizing supplies so you can locate them by touch in emergencies, methods for examining wounds without disturbing sleeping patients unnecessarily. As Klaus explained his techniques, Margaret found herself taking mental notes that would prove valuable during the night ahead. His experience with field conditions had taught him practical skills that formal nursing training hadn't covered. "The lamp placement is crucial," he continued, gesturing toward her kerosene fixture. "Too high creates harsh shadows that obscure details. Too low risks accidental contact with patients or equipment." Margaret adjusted the lamp height according to his suggestions, immediately noticing improved visibility across the treatment area. "That's much better. Thank you." Sister Anne arrived to assist with night duties, her young face showing the nervous anticipation of someone still adjusting to battlefield medicine's demands. At 22, she possessed excellent technical skills but lacked the emotional stability that came only through extended exposure to trauma. "Anne, you'll monitor the patients in the east section," Margaret instructed. "Call me immediately if anyone shows signs of fever, breathing difficulties, or unusual pain. Don't hesitate to wake me for anything that concerns you." The kerosene lamp would be their primary light source if the electrical system failed, which happened regularly due to generator problems or enemy action. Margaret had learned to trust the steady flame more than electric bulbs that could disappear without warning during critical procedures. Chaplain Morrison stopped by during his evening rounds, checking on patients who might need spiritual comfort during the vulnerable hours of darkness. "Good evening, Sister Hayes. How are our patients managing?" "Better than expected. Tommy's headaches are subsiding, and Klaus has been helpful with medical advice, despite his status as prisoner." Thomas nodded toward Klaus, who had been reading from a small German prayer book found among his personal effects. "I've been impressed by his character. War creates strange friendships sometimes." As full darkness settled over the compound, Margaret made final preparations for the night ahead. Medical supplies were organized within easy reach, patient charts updated with current conditions, and emergency procedures reviewed with Anne to ensure smooth coordination if crises arose. The compound grew quieter as most personnel settled into sleep, leaving the night shift responsible for maintaining vigilance against both medical emergencies and potential enemy action. Margaret had volunteered for this duty, partly from professional dedication and partly from personal restlessness that made sleep difficult. Colonel Whitmore's silver locket rested in her pocket, a tangible reminder of the responsibility she carried to deliver final messages to grieving families. The weight of such duties had become familiar, though no less significant, during her months of service. "Ready for another long night?" Anne asked, settling into her assigned station. "As ready as anyone can be," Margaret replied, checking the kerosene lamp one final time. Its steady flame would guide them through whatever challenges the darkness might bring, just as her grandmother's wisdom had guided 3 generations of women through their own struggles with uncertainty and loss. The torn uniform sleeve hung from Margaret's left arm like a battle standard, ripped during the frantic effort to stabilize a soldier whose arterial bleeding had soaked through every available bandage. The fabric had caught on a stretcher handle as she leaned across the patient, but she had barely noticed the tearing sound over the urgent instructions Klaus was calling out in both English and German. "Pressure here, sister. Doctor." Morrison shouted over the chaos that had erupted when 3 ambulances arrived simultaneously at 11:47 p.m., their cargo of critically wounded men pushing the night shift beyond all reasonable limits. "I need both hands free for the arterial clamp." Margaret pressed her torn sleeve against the soldier's wound, while Klaus, working from his hospital bed with his uninjured arm, guided a bewildered Sister Anne through the procedure for preparing emergency blood transfusion equipment. "The Type O donor list is in the medical files," Klaus called urgently. "Sister Anne, check the records for soldiers who volunteered for emergency donation." The wounded soldier, a young private named Collins, had lost consciousness during transport, his face ashen from blood loss that exceeded the field hospital's normal treatment protocols. His dog tags identified him as 19 years old, from a farming family in Devon, but those details seemed less important than the immediate challenge of keeping him alive through the next hour. "I can donate," Tommy Wright announced from his bed, struggling to sit up despite Margaret's earlier instructions to rest. "I'm type O, and I've recovered enough from the head injury." "Absolutely not," Margaret replied firmly, maintaining pressure on Collins's wound while Dr. Morrison worked to locate the damaged artery. "You're still experiencing dizzy spells, and blood donation could cause you to collapse." Klaus had managed to position himself where he could observe both the transfusion preparation and the surgical procedure, his medical expertise making him invaluable despite his prisoner status. "Sister Hayes, the bleeding is arterial but not from the major vessels. Dr. Morrison should be able to control it with proper clamping." The collaboration that had developed between Klaus and the British medical staff reached its peak during this midnight crisis, national boundaries dissolving completely under the pressure of saving lives. Sister Anne followed his instructions with growing confidence, her initial fear of the German prisoner replaced by gratitude for his professional guidance. "Transfusion equipment ready," Anne reported, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Margaret glanced at her torn sleeve, realizing that her uniform had become as battle-scarred as the soldiers she treated. The pristine white fabric that had once marked her as a non-combatant now bore the stains and damage that came from months of emergency medical work under impossible conditions. "Margaret, Doctor," Morrison said, using her given name instead of formal address, "I need you to take over the arterial pressure while I position the clamp. Your hands are steadier than mine right now." She shifted her grip carefully, feeling the pulse of blood that represented the difference between life and death for Private Collins. Around them, other night shift personnel treated additional casualties from the same convoy, their movements coordinated through months of practice in managing multiple emergencies simultaneously. Klaus continued providing instruction from his bed, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose medical knowledge had been tested under the most extreme conditions. "Sister Anne, the transfusion rate should be steady but not rushed. Too fast can shock the circulatory system." "How do you know so much about British medical procedures?" Anne asked, her curiosity overriding wartime suspicion. "Medical principles are universal," Klaus replied, wincing as he shifted position to better observe the procedure. "Human anatomy doesn't change based on nationality." As Dr. Morrison successfully clamped the damaged artery, Collins's color began to improve slightly, his breathing becoming more regular as the transfusion compensated for blood loss. Margaret maintained her position until the doctor confirmed that the bleeding had been controlled. "Excellent work, everyone," Dr. Morrison announced, stepping back from the surgical table. "Sister Hayes, that was textbook arterial pressure technique." Margaret looked down at her torn sleeve again, noting how the fabric had been pushed aside to reveal the skin beneath. The sleeve had sacrificed itself to save Collins's life, just as everyone in the tent had sacrificed something of themselves during the past hour. "Klaus," she said, turning toward the German prisoner, "your assistance was invaluable. Without your guidance, we might have lost him." Klaus settled back against his pillow, exhaustion evident in his pale features. "In my country, we have a saying, Der Tod kennt keine Grenzen. Death knows no borders. Neither should healing." As the immediate crisis subsided and normal night operations resumed, Margaret finally examined her torn uniform sleeve more closely. The rip extended from shoulder to elbow, revealing how close she had come to serious injury during the emergency procedure. "I can repair that," Sister Anne offered, producing a sewing kit from her supply bag. "It won't look perfect, but it will be functional." "Leave it," Margaret said quietly, studying the damage that would serve as a permanent reminder of this midnight crisis. "Some things are worth preserving exactly as they are." The torn sleeve would remain as testimony to the night when enemy and ally worked together to snatch life from death's grasp, proving that healing transcended every artificial boundary that politics and war could construct. The sunrise photograph lay beside Margaret's journal, a small black and white image captured with the camera she had carried from England but rarely used until this moment. As dawn light filtered through the tent walls, she had felt compelled to document this particular morning, understanding instinctively that some experiences required visual proof to be believed by future versions of herself. "Beautiful sunrise," Klaus observed from his bed, noting how Margaret had positioned herself near the tent opening to capture the image. You have an artist's eye for composition. Margaret studied the photograph as it developed in the makeshift darkroom solution she had prepared using chemicals from the medical supplies. The image showed streaks of gold and rose illuminating the battlefield beyond their compound, transforming a landscape of destruction into something approaching beauty. I wanted to remember how this place could look peaceful, even for a few minutes, she explained, setting the photograph aside to dry completely. In years to come, I'll need proof that beauty existed here alongside all the horror. The night shift had finally ended with Private Collins stable and recovering, his successful treatment marking the culmination of 24 hours that had tested everyone's physical and emotional limits. Margaret felt the exhaustion that came not just from lack of sleep, but from the intensity of decisions that carried life or death consequences. Tommy Wright had slept soundly through the final hours of darkness, his recovery progressing well enough that Dr. Morrison planned to discharge him to light duty within days. The boy's nightmares had diminished as his head injury healed, though Margaret suspected he would carry emotional scars long after his physical wounds disappeared. "Sister Hayes," Dr. Morrison approached with clipboard in hand, "I've received orders regarding our German prisoner. Klaus will be transferred to a POW facility this afternoon." The news struck Margaret with unexpected force, though she had known this moment would arrive eventually. Klaus had become an integral part of their medical team, his knowledge and compassion earning respect that transcended national boundaries. "What will happen to him at the prison camp?" she asked. "Standard POW protocols. Medical prisoners typically receive better treatment than combat soldiers, especially those who have demonstrated cooperation with Allied medical personnel." Margaret looked toward Klaus, who was helping Sister Anne organize medical supplies with his uninjured arm. His contributions had saved multiple lives over the past days, proving that healing truly knew no national boundaries. "Klaus," she called softly, "could I speak with you privately?" He approached her station near the tent opening, moving carefully to avoid aggravating his shoulder wound. The sunrise photograph lay on her desk, and he studied it with the same appreciation he had shown for her grandmother's kerosene lamp. "You have captured something important," he said, examining the image more closely. "This photograph shows truth that words cannot convey." "I want you to have it," Margaret said, making the decision spontaneously. "When you're in the prison camp, remembering that beauty exists might help sustain you." Klaus accepted the photograph with obvious emotion, holding it carefully as he studied the composition. "This is very generous, Sister Hayes, but why give this to me? Because you've taught me that enemies can become healers, that nationality matters less than character, that even in war we can choose compassion over hatred." Margaret's voice carried the weight of revelations that had transformed her understanding of the conflict surrounding them. "You have taught me similar lessons," Klaus replied. "British nursing care has exceeded every expectation. You and your colleagues have shown me kindness that I will remember for the rest of my life." Dr. Morrison returned with transfer documents that would formalize Klaus's departure. "The transport arrives at 1400 hours. Klaus, you'll need to gather your personal effects." "There is little to gather," Klaus said, gesturing toward the small pile of belongings that had survived his capture. "But I would like to leave something for the medical staff who saved my life." He retrieved his German medical kit, which had provided crucial supplies during recent emergencies. "Please keep this equipment. The instruments are superior to your standard issue, and the medications may save lives that would otherwise be lost." Margaret accepted the kit on behalf of the medical team, understanding that Klaus was entrusting them with tools that represented his professional identity. The gesture carried significance that exceeded the practical value of the supplies. "We will use these instruments to honor the healing mission we've shared," she promised. As morning progressed toward afternoon, the inevitability of Klaus's departure settled over the medical staff like a weight they had not anticipated. His presence had challenged their assumptions about enemies and allies, proving that individual character mattered more than the uniforms that circumstances forced people to wear. Margaret tucked the sunrise photograph into Klaus's breast pocket, ensuring he would carry a piece of their shared experience into whatever future awaited him beyond the prison camp's barbed wire boundaries. The new prayer book felt stiff and unfamiliar in Margaret's hands as she opened it. to the morning devotional, its pristine pages unmarked by the blood and tears that had sanctified her original copy. Chaplain Morrison had presented it to her the previous evening, understanding that some objects became too sacred through experience to serve their original practical purposes. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," she read aloud, her voice carrying across the recovery tent, where familiar faces had been joined by new casualties from overnight fighting. The words took on deeper meaning after 24 hours that had tested every assumption she had held about healing, humanity, and the possibility of finding grace in circumstances that seemed abandoned by divine mercy. Tommy Wright was preparing for discharge, his civilian clothes a startling reminder of the boy who had lied about his age to join a war that had nearly claimed his life. At 17, he carried experiences that would mark him forever, but Margaret had watched him discover reserves of courage and compassion that promised hope for his future. "Sister Hayes," Tommy said, approaching her morning prayer station, "I wanted to thank you before I leave, not just for the medical care, but for treating me like a man when I needed that most." Margaret closed the new prayer book carefully, noting how different it felt from her blood-stained original. "You've grown into the man you pretended to be, Tommy. Your parents will be proud of the son who returns to them." Private Collins, the soldier whose arterial bleeding had torn her uniform sleeve, sat up in his bed for the first time since the midnight crisis. His color had returned to normal, and his appetite suggested complete recovery from the blood loss that had nearly killed him. "The Jerry who helped save me," Collins said. "Is he really gone?" "Klaus was transferred yesterday afternoon. He left medical supplies that will help save other soldiers' lives." Collins nodded thoughtfully, processing the reality that his survival had depended partly on assistance from someone he had been trained to consider an enemy. "Strange world, isn't it? Makes you wonder what other things we've got backwards." Margaret understood his confusion, recognizing the disorientation that came from discovering humanity in people who were supposed to represent pure evil. Her own assumptions had been challenged and transformed by Klaus's presence, forcing her to confront the gap between propaganda and personal experience. Dr. Morrison emerged from the surgical tent, his face showing the satisfaction that came from successful treatment of the previous night's casualties. "Sister Hayes, the morning reports show all patients stable. Your night shift work was exemplary." "Thank you, Doctor, though I suspect Klaus's medical guidance made the crucial difference. His contributions will be noted in my official report. Military command needs to understand that medical knowledge transcends national boundaries when lives are at stake." As Margaret prepared for another day of caring for wounded soldiers, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred within herself over the past 24 hours. The woman who had begun yesterday morning with rigid assumptions about enemies and allies had evolved into someone who recognized that healing required openness to unexpected sources of wisdom and compassion. Sister Catherine approached with the morning medication schedule, her experienced eyes noting the new prayer book in Margaret's hands. "The chaplain mentioned he gave you a replacement. Are you ready to let go of the old one?" Margaret touched her pocket, where the blood-stained prayer book rested beside Colonel Whitmore's silver locket. "Not yet. Some things are too precious to discard, even when they're too damaged for practical use. Wisdom beyond your years, dear. The objects that carry our memories become sacred through experience, not manufacture." The recovery tent hummed with quiet conversation as patients shared breakfast and discussed their hopes for eventual return to civilian life. Margaret moved among them, checking bandages and administering medications, but also listening to stories that revealed the men beneath the uniforms. As the morning progressed toward another day of medical challenges, Margaret carried both prayer books, pristine new volume for practical devotions, and the blood-stained original that had been consecrated by its journey through hell alongside her. Together, they represented the dual nature of faith that war had taught her, the need for fresh hope combined with respect for wisdom earned through suffering. The tent filled with morning light as another day began in the endless rhythm of healing that would continue long after individual battles ended and specific wars concluded. Margaret's basic day had become the foundation for countless others, each one offering new opportunities to choose compassion over hatred, healing over destruction, hope over despair.